The star is just entering the galaxy. So, for anyone who's out there looking at art, which is a really good thing to do, but we're going to start. And before we move into the next talk, I just want to say that was a bravura exchange and performance, and we thank you profoundly for it. I promise you, it was sublime. So, in keeping with many of the issues that we've been talking about all day and that were raised in the conversation between Lowry and Joyce, is our next speaker, Garth Johnson. And Garth is the curator of ceramics at the Everson, which has a stunning collection, and he curates with insight and ingenuity. And one of the questions is, of course, you know, what is art? What isn't art? All of this business of demarcation and function and material and challenging all of that. And so you see what's behind me, and that pretty much conveys the essence. I am going to step down. He's taking my place, and it will, I think, propel the themes that we've been talking about forward. And we're really thrilled to have him. And you should go to the Everson and see the Ceramics National Collection. Garth.
All right. So last year, the Everson co-hosted the Initiatives in Art and Culture Arts and Crafts Conference. And for co-hosting that for you, this is how you do me. You put me right after Joyce and make me come up on this stage. All right, so I'm so happy to be here. And speaking of conferences, I'm happy to say that next year's Arts and Crafts Conference, at least, was so beguiled by Central New York that Initiatives in Arts and Culture is coming back and will be doing their conference in Rochester. So en route to Rochester, come visit me at the Everson. So today I'm going to be talking about Adelaide, Alsop, Robineau, and then doing a little cross-section of artists and the way that artists thought about their position in either art or craft. But I wanted to start out by talking about my institution, the Everson Museum of Art. We are at an American art conference, and something that I'll bet that the vast majority of you don't know is that the Everson was the first American museum to declare that they only collected American art, that they specialized in American art. And that was back in 1911. So at the time, so just to contextualize it for you, Syracuse was a bustling city. You know, the Erie Canal went right through it. Industry was huge. The money was flowing. We were a top 30 city in the United States in terms of size and vitality. And at the time, if you wanted to start a museum and you wanted your museum to be on the map, it certainly had to contain old masters and have gravitas. So in 1911, for the Everson, which was the Syracuse Museum of Fine Arts at the time, to declare that they only collected American art was a very counterintuitive thing. We are a museum of firsts, so the first to just collect American art. We were the first museum designed by I.M. Pei. So here is our wonderful museum. Here's an image of the inside of the museum, which contains this incredible spiral staircase made entirely of concrete. We were the first museum to collect video as art and to have a full-time video curator, by the way, who was David Ross, future Whitney director. And David was allowed to choose a tech to help run the video department, and he chose a Syracuse University grad student named Bill Viola to do that. The Everson was also the first museum to collect, to my knowledge, ceramics as art and not as decorative art. and not as design. Ceramics has always had a level playing field when it comes to the Everson, and that's because of this woman, Adelaide Alsop Robineau, the cornerstone that our ceramics collection rests on. And we've been talking about, the word canon. And Adelaide Alsop Robineau, when it comes to 20th century ceramics, certainly is part of the canon, but I'm going to argue that she has all of the components to make her canon when it comes to being thought of as fine art. Amen. So I'm building my talk today around pithy little quotes, and Adelaide Alsop Robineau provides us with many, many of them. So chiefly, she started a magazine called Ceramic Studio in 1899. And she actually came up as a porcelain painter, as a china painter. She was one of the most in demand, one of the most famous china painters in the entire country. She had a studio in Manhattan. And so she started this magazine to help raise the level of art and design in the porcelain painting community. And so in her second ever episode, issue in 1899, she declared, "We must see our decorative work in the same big way as the painter in oils before we can do big work, and work that will be art as long as the world lasts and longer than any canvas." So this gives you an idea, I think, of the scope of her ambition as an artist. So just to show you the scope of her ambition when it comes to porcelain painting, this is an absolutely unique item. This is a Limoges low bowl from 1897. You can see that her subject is this sort of chrysanthemum in the middle. She's using colors that are sort of drawn from Japanese prints and that are super kind of shocking. She's doing all of this incredible line work. You will never see another piece of porcelain painted work like this, particularly from 1897. So she was putting her work where her mouth is in terms of trying to demonstrate a broader awareness of design for her audiences. These are images of her magazine, Ceramic Studio, and the Smithsonian has actually digitized all of these issues. And if you'd ever really like to get a great idea of the ideas that are being exchanged, there are many, many like patterns for doing rose painting on tiny porcelain teacups, but also manifestos and quarrels, and one of the best things, the advertisements that are in the back of the magazines as well. Here's a quote from her husband, Samuel Robineau, who is kind of a saint. He sublimated his own masculine ego in support of his wife's career for his entire life. And so here is him arguing in 1917 about his wife's position sort of within the fine art canon. He said, "Mrs. Robineau is not a potter, only an artist, and for the kind of work she does, she should be a millionaire." By that time, she had only made about $10,000 selling her work. She always made a living from her magazine rather than her work, despite the fact that her work had been in the World's Fair. Tiffany exhibited her porcelains. Her story is absolutely amazing. Oh, the image is a little blown out here. Adelaide Alsop Robineau had incredible range. So one of the things that is her dirty little secret is that she actually hated porcelain painting. And she had aspirations after going to World's Expositions to being able to control every facet of making pots. So at the time, it was beyond the pale for a woman to sit behind a potter's wheel and throw a pot. She goes to Alfred University. She takes 2 weeks of classes where she learns the basics of throwing on the wheel, the basics of glaze chemistry, and then everything else she had throughout her career is absolutely self-taught. Within 4 years of making her very first pot, she's showing her work in New York at Tiffany's and being acknowledged at international expositions. In 1909, she's called up to be a faculty member at something called the People's University in St. Louis, which was kind of an educational experiment to give women marketable skills. And she assembled a really incredible ceramics department there that also had Frederick Hurton Reed, who designed Fiesta Ware, as one of her sort of co-professors, and also Taxil Doat, the French porcelain maker. And by this time, Adelaide Alsop Robineau had actually made her own porcelain, and something that people never really grasp, and that I know I didn't really until I started kind of doing the math and the history, was that porcelain is a material that only existed in factories, both in Europe and in the United States. Nobody had their own recipe for porcelain. It was all controlled by industry, and very, very tightly controlled. So Adelaide Robineau writes to Taxil Doat in France and gets his recipe for porcelain, which is adapted from Sèvres. And she is certainly the first person in North America as an independent artist to develop her own porcelain formula. And what did she do after she developed it and perfected it? She gave it away in her magazine and shared it with the rest of the world. So she was also open source before open source. This gives you a little bit of an idea about her range. She could work in the tightest of tight ways with her own porcelains, but she could also work in a very loose manner as well. She was one of the first Americans to work with lava glazes. So these pieces were all done concurrently with her major masterpiece, the Scarab Vase. So the Scarab Vase is arguably the most famous, the most important vessel in American history. And I'll tell you why that is in just a moment. The last time that it was in New York City, it was actually because it was stolen in 1989. And it was recovered from a couple of Brooklyn thieves who were a little bit bumbling. But that is another lecture for another time, IAC, so invite me back. So I'm going to tell you a few things about why the Scarab Vase is the most important vessel in American history. So it's made of her porcelain, which is this foundational porcelain that is shared with the world through her magazine. One of the things that people will tell you is most important about the Scarab Vase is the amount of time that it took for her to make it, which is 1,000 hours. And that's the carving alone. So it's about 17 inches tall, 16 and 5 inches tall. Every inch of it, and again, it's too bad that the image is blown out a little bit. Every part of it is intricately carved. And the carving is all done when the porcelain is bone dry. So she was taking little ivory knitting needles and she would braid away an area about the size of a nickel in an entire day's work. And she did all of this work when she had 3 kids, like nipping at her heels, a daughter who was 10, a son who was 8, and another daughter who was 4. And that fortitude is absolutely amazing. I could barely get dinner on the table when my kids were that age. So it took 1,000 hours of exacting work to create this. But I'm not here to talk about that fortitude and the amount of time that it took her to make it, although that's very important. I'm here to talk about the different levels that she operated on. So this is an American art conference, right? Do we have any Egyptian specialists lurking out there today? Okay, thank God I can breathe slightly easier. All right, so I'm gonna break it down and put on my Egyptologist hat for just a moment. And the connection between the Scarab Vase and the way that Egyptians viewed scarabs is very, very important. So in Egypt, in hieroglyphics, in different writings, teachings, the scarab is someone who comes up many times. And in mythology, it's because of this connection with a sun god named Khepri. And Khepri takes the form of a scarab who rolls the sun disk across the sky every day. And so when you talk to an Egyptologist and you ask them about one of these images of a scarab, the scarab always has the sun disk that they are holding up. I'm going to change my hat from the Egyptologist hat to maybe a biologist hat. So a scarab does in fact roll something around all day, but it is not the sun. What is a scarab rolling all day? Dung. So a scarab beetle is a dung beetle. And anytime you see a scarab, don't listen to the Egyptologist. That scarab is being shown with their ball of dung above it. All right, so here's a great picture of a great ball of dung. It's nice that this isn't right after lunch. All right, so to set the scene a little bit, during this time period where Adelaide Robineau had to overcome her kids being around, she had a bigger obstacle, and that was toxic men. So when she made the scarab vase, she was a visiting professor in St. Louis, and the studio that she was working in was run by French assistants who came with the French artist Taxil Doat. And in particular, the glaze chemist and the person who did throwing for Taxil Doat took exception to the fact that she was a woman, a powerful woman with her own magazine, with her own ideas, and they gave her bad advice. They badmouthed her, they gossiped, and they outright sabotaged her work sometimes. And Adelaide Robineau's response to this toxic environment was not to cave, was not to leave. She certainly didn't have a human resources department that she could call on, but instead her reaction was sticking out her middle finger by creating her career masterpiece to triumph in the face of all of the toxic men that were around her. And what I'm about to tell you is something that I've certainly never seen another critic or another scholar write about Adelaide Robineau, and one of the reasons why I would argue that she is canon as a fine artist. And that is the fact that I would contend that the scarab vase is a self-portrait. So the real title of the scarab vase, I'm going to go back a little bit, is The Apotheosis of the Toiler, the ultimate glorification of the toiler. And of course, the toiler is the scarab who's rolling its sun disk around all day. But it is Adelaide Alsop Robineau who is deciding to create her masterpiece through incredible labor. And she is rolling her ball of shit, just like the scarab is rolling its ball of shit. I didn't say that I wouldn't cuss, Joyce. So you can see that every scarab vase has, or every scarab on the vase has its ball of dung. But not only that, on the lid of the scarab vase, and this is from a digital scan, a digital recreation of it, you can see that the finial on the top of the vase is the ball of dung that all of the scarabs are converging on. And it's actually double walled. There is an interior volume and an exterior volume, and she's carved through the exterior. And not only that, most other artists would put the finial of the scarab vase on a little post. Adelaide Robineau has taken the three front legs of the three scarabs on the top of the lid, and it's the skinny, skinny front legs of those scarabs that are holding up that intricately carved ball of dung. Adelaide Alsop Robineau was not shy when it came to her own achievements, and I can't imagine how these men, thought that they could cross her, and it did not work out very well for them, actually. They were sent back to France within the year. The scarab vase, after she created it, and again, I'm going to argue that the important thing is not the amount of time that it took, but the next thing, I think, is the most important thing. So she packed up the scarab vase along with 49 other porcelains that she had made, and she sent it to the World's Fair in Turin, Italy, the next year in 1911. Adelaide Alsop Robineau was the first American ceramic artist to be given the Grand Prix at a World's Fair in ceramics. And before Adelaide Robineau, Americans were mostly thought of as second tier, backwater. And after Adelaide Robineau, Americans, and still to this day, are thought of as innovators when it comes to ceramic art. And this all rests on her shoulders. So in 1915, a few years after the World's Fair triumph, she argues to the director of the Syracuse Museum of Fine Arts that he needs to make an investment in a good body of her work. And she's suggesting a grouping of 33 pots. And so she writes a letter to the museum director talking it up and saying that this is something that the Chamber of Commerce is going to be sending out for future generations. And she says, Syracuse has at least two unique boasts to make. There is the salt, which gives it its savor. Syracuse was based on salt manufacturing. And then there are the Robineau porcelains. And I'm here to say that over 100 years later, people make international pilgrimages to come to Syracuse to see the scarab vase and to see the Robineau porcelains. And it's amazing to walk by them every day. Uranium was brought up earlier, and all of the talks are connecting in certain ways. In 1928, Adelaide Alsop Robineau contracts leukemia after working in uranium glazes, which many other ceramic artists were working on at the time. It is fast acting. She knows that it is fatal. And so she goes about designing her cinerary urn, which you are looking at. She dies before she could even glaze it. And one of her students, Carlton Atherton, had to glaze it for her. But to give you an idea of her flintiness and her dry humor, she always said during this time that she knew that she was dying, that her cremation was going to be her final firing. And so it was her final firing, but she got the last laugh, as she always did. In 1930, the Everson took in nearly 100 other pieces, including the scarab vase and including her cinerary urn. So we have a permanent display for Adelaide Alsop Robineau's work where you can see the scarab vase, but her cinerary urn, which is in our permanent collection, is always there. And she listens to me telling this story many, many times every week for different visitors. The other thing that's really important about Adelaide Robineau and the scarab vase is that it leads the director of the museum to create, as a memorial to Adelaide Robineau, the first ceramic national exhibition. And this is the first juried ceramic competition, the first real national platform for independent ceramic artists in the United States. And so that begins in 1932, and those exhibitions go through 1972. Adelaide Alsop Robineau also got a memorial exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She was the first woman to have a solo show at the museum, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it would be many, many years later until the first living woman got an exhibition there. So the Ceramic Nationals are actually the taproot of American studio ceramics, and every major studio ceramic artist of the 20th century gets their start through the Ceramic Nationals, and I'm showing you the very, very modest beginnings of them. We have that permanent collection, and we display it every day, and it's an amazing look through an amazing history. But ceramics, I think, has always had a second place seat or third place seat, certainly a marginalized seat when it comes to the pecking order of the arts in the United States. I mentioned design, I mentioned decorative arts, and all of those things are true. This is Charles Fergus Binns, who founded the program at Alfred. And he's talking about the fact that on one hand, there's a manufactory teeming with hands, riotous with wheels, turning out wares by the thousands, supplying the demands of the many. On the other, there is the artist potter. He labors at his bench in severe and sincere devotion to his chosen vocation. So here is the genesis of ceramic artists referring to themselves as artist potters, artisan potters, and the language among people who take the reins into their own hand to control their own glazes and their own forms rather than working with an entire studio starts to become a little bit more familiar to a fine art language. I also, in finding this quote, discovered another quote which kind of made me blanch. This was in 1899, addressing a national conference of China painters. He said, "Kilns are as capricious as women, and you well know what that means." Holy cow, like I would definitely not talk to an audience like that. Very briefly, George Orr, I think, is always thought of as an ultra maverick when it comes to ceramics. Certainly he was, but he worked in a similar way to Adelaide Robineau. He went to the same World's Fairs and promoted his work in the same ways. I love that, like David Drake, he loved to cover his pots with writing. And this is actually a bit of writing that is on an umbrella stand that he sent to the Smithsonian. And, you know, we've got the Marcel Duchamp exhibition right around the corner. And this is some wild Dadaist poetry, I think, that is scrawled onto the side of this umbrella stand. So 1937, this is an article from Fortune magazine that's called "The Art with the Inferiority Complex." And this is built around the Everson Ceramic National taking an international tour and being shown around Europe. But it unpacks some of the baggage that ceramic artists carry with them in terms of being inferior to other media. Just very briefly, I realized that I had to talk about ceramics as a bit of a permeable membrane. So we've been looking at artists who have a bit of a chip on their shoulder when it comes to being thought of as fine art, but certainly it goes the other way. And particularly in Europe, you were seeing in the late 19th century, European artists coming to ceramics in order to experience something different and make something different, maybe sometimes with lower stakes. There were all sorts of different reasons. And there are American, we're talking about American art, there are American equivalents, and one of the amazing ones is Jackson Pollock, who in his darkest time, I think, in the late 1930s, he was suffering from alcoholism and depression and writer's block. He discovered the healing properties of ceramics. So I can't remember who suggested it, but he actually took up china paints. And you are looking at a porcelain painted bowl, I think it's a Limoges bowl as well, that he made to sort of fight back some of these forces of the demons that he was fighting. And you can see this particular piece in the MFA Boston. One of the most amazing, vital ceramic artists that you can talk about in the late 19th century is actually Paul Gauguin. And Paul Gauguin was looking at French potters in particular, like Chaplet and Delaherche. And in particular, these are artists who are starting to work in high fire methods, and they're boiling their glazes, and they are doing really expressive things. And it's Paul Gauguin who actually is sort of most eloquent about anthropomorphizing his materials. I love, he says, so he's actually going to a Universal Exposition and looking at the ceramics there, and he says, so the substance that emerges from the fire takes on the character of the kiln and thus becomes graver, more serious, the longer it stays in hell, the fire. Hence, all the junk on exhibit, because a brief firing is much more stylish and easier to do. He identified with the ceramics actually being in the flame, and he was empathizing with those objects in a way that I think is kind of bracingly contemporary, especially if you look at what contemporary artists are making. I love the Art Institute of Chicago, and when they go deep on doing 3D scans and all over 3D presentations of their pieces. So this is a Gauguin piece that is in the Art Institute of Chicago collection. 3 more pieces that were recently exhibited in St. Louis. And they're ultra contemporary to my eyes. I am not talking about Pablo Picasso. I am focusing on a few artists who came to ceramics humbly, and Picasso never came to anything humbly. Marc Chagall is terrific. His works are incredible. He wrote, "These ceramics are a sort of foretaste, the result of my life in the south of France, where one feels so strongly the significance of this craft." And he was coming to ceramics by working with Picasso in Vallauris. And here are a couple of his incredible pieces in ceramic. This is 1952. Juan Miró worked with the Spanish potter Artigas. And he said, "To me, rich and vigorous material seems necessary to give the spectator a blow between the eyes at first sight, which must hit him before other thought can intervene. In this way, poetry expressed visually speaks its own language." And his pieces are incredible. And by the way, a lot of these pieces live in the Museum Het Groothuis in the Netherlands, who has a specialty in collecting artists' ceramics. This one actually incorporates stones, which are fired into the ceramic piece. I could take these to Art Miami right now and convince everybody that this was a very precocious 20-year-old putting these things together right now. Jean Cocteau, I love the fact that he just says, "I'm proud to have become an artisan ceramist." And he comes to ceramics later in his life, and he embraces them until the end of his life. All right, so back to the United States. Ceramics is being marginalized, and artist craftsmen, artist potters are coming into their own by the 1950s. I picked a couple of people. Betty Fevas, an Oregon potter who lived in Pendleton, who wound up making audacious, amazing sculptures. And most of the artists that I'm talking about here had a practice of making functional pots, or as Betty Fevas calls them, kitchen pots. So she says, I consider myself a sculptor, but I make pots too. And the kind of pots I make are kitchen pots strictly. To me, this is just as expressive as the sculpture I make. Humbly, but embracing a duality in her aspirations toward fine art, but a commitment toward ceramics as a functional medium. Peter Voulkos, of course, and I could just turn this exhibition or this talk out talking just about Peter Voulkos. He, of course, is the person who sort of breaks through in terms of making wheel-thrown ceramics into sculptural vessels. Peter Voulkos was an interesting case where he always had ambitions to join the fine art world, but he liked to protest and sort of talk like he didn't have that ambition. So this is my favorite quote from him. I'd rather subscribe to welding today. In fact, I do. It makes more sense than art forum. Yet, a few years later, he turns to working exclusively in bronze to catch the idea or the eyes of the fine art world, which didn't really work, and he eventually returns back to ceramics. Robert Arneson. So, oh my gosh, toilets have actually turned up a few times and have been spoken about. Robert Arneson is interesting. Not long after taking his position at the University of California, Davis, he starts to create this scatological body of work with toilets. And from the very earliest, Robert Arneson was actually embraced by the fine art world. Right out of grad school, he was given a 2-person show at the Oakland Museum. The Alan Stone Gallery plucked him up and started showing his work when he was making these difficult toilets. Didn't sell a damn thing, by the way. In talking about his identity, I think he had a privileged place where he could always kind of talk out of both sides of his mouth. He was embraced by the fine art world in a way that almost no one in the ceramics world was, but he liked to joke, this is another quote, I'd finally made a Bob Arneson, I'd finally arrived at a piece of work that stood firmly on its ground. It was vulgar, I was vulgar. And then he loved using a slogan from industry that actually came from Duncan Commercial Ceramics. Ceramics, the world's most fascinating hobby. And he loved to be kind of self-deprecating when it came to the status of ceramics, even though he was getting the most attention of anybody. A mea culpa. I set out to create a pretty comprehensive talk, but I did so on the basis of trying to find pithy quotes from different artists. And when it came to looking to indigenous artists, indigenous artists have been signing their names to their work since Nampeo in the early 20th century. Asian American artists, Toshiko Takeezu, didn't really give us the pithy quotes because she was never about aggrandizing herself. She was about living her lifestyle as an artist. Sergeant Claude Johnson, revered modernist African-American sculptor from San Francisco. This was the one quote that I could find, and it came actually from an Archives of American Art oral history. And the person who's doing the interview actually comes from the craft world and was asking him all about his wood panels and the way he joined the wood panels together and was doing all of these process-based things. And he just said, why are you asking me this question? So he was doubly marginalized, both the materials that he was working in and his position as a Black man. And so the last thing that he wanted to talk about was the actual materials. He wanted to demonstrate his work for his people. All right, I'm going to breeze through this. I'm almost at the end, and I'm kind of coming to the end of my time, but I wanted to come to a period starting in the mid-1960s where the Americans, in terms of successful fine artists, painters, sculptors, accepted by the New York art world, actually do start to visit clay. And the first major way that this happens is through a project that Art in America actually helms in 1964. And this is super interesting to delve into. They did a project called Ceramics by 12 Artists, and they used Bennington pottery in Vermont. There was a potter named David Gill who had made friends with the sculptor David Smith in particular. And they came up with the idea of sending Helen Frankenthaler and David Smith, Leonard Baskin, 12 artists up to Bennington to make a body of work in clay. Only they did it as a commercial project. They were thinking of this more as knickknacks and affordable versions of Helen Frankenthaler that you could get for your own home. Nonetheless, some amazing work came out of it. Here's an incredible little sculpture that David Smith made. And so we're going to go from 1964 to the mid-1970s. So in 1975, my museum, the Everson Museum of Art, did a project that I'm betting almost no one here has heard of. And it was a project called New Works in Clay. Margie Hudo, who was my predecessor at the Everson Museum and also a professor at Syracuse University, was well embedded within the fine art world here in New York City. She would go out drinking with Clement Greenberg. Her husband showed at the Pace Gallery and was a painter. So they wrote an NEA grant, and they got an incredible amount of money to bring Billy Al Bankston, Stanley Boxer, Anthony Caro, Helen Frankenthaler, Jules Olitsky, Larry Poons, David Smith to Syracuse to create a body of work in clay. Anthony Caro worked in clay from this period until he died. He became obsessed with clay and bought a place in the Hudson Valley. Helen Frankenthaler. The style of her painting actually changed after she worked in ceramics in Syracuse, and she actually veered away toward the end of her life from using stain technique officially to creating paint like more of a material. Billy Al Bankston, always the contrarian, decided to do a set of cups and saucers and demitasses to actually be commercial, and worked with Syracuse China and their decorators to do it. And they're incredible, but not very functional as objects. Larry Poons had left his dot paintings behind and was looking for the next thing. And he actually built a gigantic wall out of clay and then cut it into tiles, and 100% this pioneered the way that he continues to work in clay. And if you go to Larry Poons' website, you'll see 50 years later, he is still using that picture of him with clay behind him as his artist's portrait. So I'm happy to say that we are doing a 50th anniversary show and bringing all of this work out. We've been working with Helen Frankenthaler's foundation, different artists, and if you want a chance to experience all of this work in person, come on up to Syracuse. The show opens at the end of June and will be up through nearly the end of the year. Judy Chicago, of course, strikes blows for gender equality and calling out the fact that it is not just, these materials are in many cases being marginalized because they are traditionally women's materials. The inclusion of women's crafts like China painting and needlework was intended to pay homage to women's too often unacknowledged creative contributions, while calling into question some of the distinctions between high and low art. And so I wanted to pause on China painting right now in the mid to late 1970s. And there's a great through line of China painting here. And it's interesting that, ladies and gentlemen, I think the debate, is China painting a fine art, was settled in 1980 by President Jimmy Carter. So in 1980, Jimmy Carter signed a presidential proclamation declaring porcelain painting to be a fine art. So there. There's some language for it. Absolutely incredible. So we know that at least porcelain painting has gotten across the Jordan. Betty Woodman is a functional potter. She moves to New York City in 1980 and embeds herself within the pattern and decoration painters. She collaborates with Joyce Kozloff, and it's interesting that she is now known as someone who is very much accepted by the fine art world. She was shown by Salon 94. She was actually the first living woman to get that retrospective at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And there she is with some of that work. But back in 2003, when asked about the fine art world and ceramics, she answered, I'm not sure it's changed about clay being accepted in the art world so much. And then she gave a laugh. And I think that was absolutely true back in the early 2000s. But certainly the porcelain ceiling, I think, has been breached now. I think that's a whole other lecture to do. And so thinking about the ways that the change actually happens in a sustainable way is interesting, but it's so interesting to look at the way that both accepted fine artists and artists who are working in craft materials think about their work and the headwinds that they're up against. In closing, I want to say that every curator at the Everson Museum of Art has come away with a signature achievement. Margie Hudo brought all of those artists to Syracuse to work. The Ceramic Nationals are an amazing achievement. But 2 years ago, the Everson started an experiment that no other museum in the United States would take on, which we are partnering with the most voracious collector of functional pottery in the United States, if not God's green earth. I love that all of these Amon Carter people are here. A Dallas-based woman named Louise Rosenfield, who has 4,500 pieces of contemporary functional pottery. And when asked about her collection, she's always said, rather than donating my collection to a museum, I'd much rather give it to a restaurant. Let all of those pieces be broken, and maybe that last remaining piece can go into a museum. We are doing her one better. 2 years ago, we opened Cafe Louise, and we currently have 700 pieces from her collection and free reign to use all of them for function in our cafe. So if you come to the Everson, you will be served in our cafe food on works of art from amazing artists and ones who are ancestors now. There is a Karen Carnes cup that is circulating. Betty Woodman's work circulates through this. If it gets broken, it is part of the circle of life, and Louise will shop more. So I want to invite everybody to Syracuse. I want everybody to think about the connections between fine art and food and life, and we want to embolden all of your senses. And if that's not fine art, I don't know what is. So thank you. I think it's kind of a fool's errand to give Joyce Scott a piece of jewelry, but I have something for you. One of the first things that I did when I got to Syracuse was to actually do enamel pins of the scarab vase. And I've been wearing one on my lapel today. But Joyce, if you bring yourself to wear something that isn't necessarily 100% artisanally handmade, at least you'll know that this is a badass woman and a display of feminist ceramics. So anyway, I'm out of time. Thank you, and thanks Initiatives in Art and Culture.